Okay, everyone, let's get started now. It's 10 o'clock. So welcome to our webinar, Complete Streets in Suburban and Rural Communities. We're going to be hearing from Steve DeGeorge from the Ventura County Transportation Commission, Chris Sang at the Western Riverside Council of Governments, Miguel Ramos at the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health, and Sam Corbett of Alta Planning and Design. And before we get started, I wanted to tell you about a new program at SCAG. We're gearing up for the 2018 Sustainable Communities Program. And so this is going to be a funding opportunity for integrated land use, green region initiative, and active transportation projects for cities and municipalities. It's the same as the sustainability planning grants. We changed the name for it to be more all-encompassing. The call for applications is coming soon, early September. Applications are going to be due on November 15th. And if you have any more questions, you can call Caitlin Sims at sims@scag.ca.gov for more information. And then also some housekeeping before we get started. We're going to have all of the presentations go first, and then time at the end for Q&A, and we're going to have everyone type their questions into the chat box, and I'll read them as we go, so that way it can go more orderly. So first, we're going to get started with Steve DeGeorge of Ventura County Transportation Commission.
All right, good morning. I hope that everyone can see me and hear me. That would be a good start to this. The Ventura County Transportation Commission, this was a few years back now, sought to fund more substantial and transformational bike projects within Ventura County, but there were a number of barriers that had been sort of standing in the way to doing that. One is that if you're familiar with Ventura County, you know that we have a number of progressive land use ordinances, and it's kept all 10 of our cities very separate. There are no contiguous borders. So each city had a fairly developed, I've lost my presentation was up, India, but I've lost it for some reason. Okay, as I was saying, in Ventura County, we have fairly restrictive land use laws or ordinances that shunt all growth into cities. So there are large tracts of land undeveloped or in agriculture under cultivation between cities. And because of that, each city has a pretty substantial bike network. But between cities, the connective tissue between cities, there wasn't a network of bike lanes to support a regional bike network or bike travel. There was no adopted bicycle master plan by the county, which would allow for development. So VCTC undertook the task of putting together a plan, and under the auspices of the Ventura County Bicycle Wayfinding Plan. One of the other things that we wound up taking on with this that you won't see in the slides, but I'll talk about at the end, was in Ventura County, there's also no transportation measure providing local funds for match. So we were also not able to fund larger scale projects. We were annually allocating a small amount of funds and splitting it 11 ways. So that really worked against us. India, could you advance the next slide, please?
Yep.
Great. Through the RFP process, we hired Alta Planning and Design to conduct our wayfinding study and to identify and prioritize a network of regional bike paths. And ultimately, it led to the adoption of 17 routes, 413 miles, with uniform signage throughout. And I'll walk you through the process by which we did that. Next slide. We separated the project into three component parts. Wayfinding foundation, this is really the guiding principles for this project. The point of the project and what we drove home really was connectivity between cities and between our neighboring counties. And connectivity by real use. And by that I mean we engaged real cyclists. We had city staff participating in the project, but more than that, we emphasized making sure we had real riders. We engaged local bike clubs, bike advocacy groups, to ensure that we were capturing where people really wanted to ride rather than where the engineers thought we should put routes. The second was to really cinch down route paths, to know turn by turn where the routes were going, and then to prioritize them to aid in future development and funding. Lastly, in the plan was a wayfinding toolkit. We designed signage that would be common throughout the county so that people would understand from community to community that the bike path was continuing on, and that was more of an adventure than the previous two elements. And lastly, again, what I'll talk about at the end, the fourth component, once the wayfinding plan was adopted and we had sort of the technical aspects done, VCTC took on reshaping the way we funded active transportation, or really bicycle funding, so that we could get more transformative projects and develop the regional network. Next slide. The planning process was broken down into fairly traditional component parts, capturing existing conditions, community outreach, route identification, a gaps analysis, route prioritization, and sign design. But how we accomplish these traditional steps might be a little bit more non-traditional. We tried to do things in a little different manner. And from my standpoint and from the project standpoint, we achieved a pretty good success with the non-traditional elements. Next slide. Of course, key is good data collection, and we used a number of tools. We used everyone's GIS and tapped into what they had. We utilized Google and air mapping to have and help us compile a good understanding of the routes on the road. We compiled information on where shoulders existed, where they did not, private roads versus public roads, where the gaps occurred, where we were constricted by bridges. There was a good amount of ground truthing. We, during data collection, we rode a number of proposed routes so that we would have a really good understanding. And of course, our project oversight committee, again, I can't emphasize this enough, not only did we have the city and county staffs, but the bike clubs and real bike advocates, real riders participated and knew the street system really intimately, so that we had really good ground truthing efforts in our data collection. Next slide. We started with sort of intuitively, we knew where the routes should go on a rough basis. So we started with 17 proposed routes, focusing on connectivity. And we knew that not all of the routes that we would propose were suitable for building, but we thought this was a good place to start, and that we would sort of deconstruct them and reconstruct them as the project went on. Next slide. One of the more non-traditional avenues we took for outreach was we took those proposed routes and we took all the existing routes within Ventura County and we created a bike wiki. And we let the general public log into the bike wiki and draw their own routes and provide comments. And in this, we garnered 278 individuals and some 686 comments where people were drawing their own routes, where they wanted to go, commenting on existing routes, down to, you know, these shrubs need to be trimmed, there are potholes here, this is not a good way to get from Moore Park to Simi, we should reroute. And the range of comments we had was really great public input. We felt like we had very tight comments and very specific comments that would allow us to then really propose much more succinct routes. Next slide. Before you could log into the bike wiki, though, you had to take a short survey so we could sort of identify who was commenting on the wiki. And not surprisingly, we found that most of our comments were coming from fairly confident recreational riders. Sort of overwhelmingly, you know, we had weekly riders, very regular riders, most of which felt very comfortable riding on the road with or without shoulders. But at least we had a sense of who was commenting. And I think this is common throughout the region where most of our riders are recreational. We did have, you know, some commuting public. We had almost 20% of our respondents were commuters, but the majority, the vast majority, were recreational riders who were very comfortable on the streets. Next slide, please. We took all of that public input and our proposed routes, and then we did an evaluation of those routes. And we prioritized and evaluated the routes by a number of weighted criteria. We looked at route readiness, which is the infrastructure in place? Are there shoulders? Are they paved? Could we pave them? You know, are we cut off, you know, from completing a route by any, you know, geographic feature? We have a very large grade which separates the county, and so we had to find ways around that. Safety and comfort level of the route. Can the route be ridden by a beginner? Do you have to be an expert? Are there blind turns, steep grades, narrow shoulders? Regional connections. Does it connect people and places? Are we connecting population centers? Will it be useful? Then we looked at real users. We looked at the needs analysis, and we used the Strava heat maps as one measure. And are they currently being used? We weighed that against our comments, against our proposed routes, and it told us whether we were sort of on the right track. It was sort of a good measuring stick by which we knew we were in the right place or not. Additionally, we looked at community support, how many comments we had on any particular route. You know, was it a popular route? Did we have one comment versus 30 on a route? And then lastly, for decision points, when we were trying to decide, should we go left here? Should we go right here? Is this really the route that we want to take? We had teams of riders go out and actually ride those decision points and make grounded decisions on which way any particular route should go. And those those riders would bring back their comments to the oversight committee and make the final pathway decisions. Next slide. The prioritization of the routes really helped in two main ways. It allowed local jurisdictions, especially the unincorporated county, to have some objective criteria when it came to investing in these routes. And this really helped later on when we changed the funding scenario and brought money to bear on route development. The characteristics of high scores versus low scores. A high score would mean a high degree of readiness. You know, there were shoulders that were wide enough to pave. It was a comfortable ride. It had good connectivity and heavy community support. A low degree of readiness meant that maybe there were high traffic speeds, you know, narrow shoulders, and less public support. And because of the weighted scoring, this was not simply a popularity test. The highest route in popularity actually wound up scoring very much in the middle of the pack because it didn't serve as many people. It didn't connect communities as well as some of the others. So although it was popular, it ranked lower on the route. And finally, our final route selection and prioritization was put back out to public review through bike clubs, through online, again, an online survey. And again, this is more non-traditional, at community gathering spots. We sponsored booths at farmers markets throughout the county and, you know, community celebrations like Earth Day events. And we got a surprising amount of input through the farmers market. It was really a popular way to reach the biking community. Next slide. Lastly, we tackled sign design, and what we really wanted here was commonality in signage throughout the county so that riders would know they were on a route that was taking them from point A to point B, and they were in the right place. And we went through in sign design a wide array of sign options, from the very ornate branded route destination signs to the simple and direct, here it is, here's where you're going and how far it is. And by a process of elimination, and this was actually a fairly vigorous discussion over sign design, by a process of elimination, the Oversight Committee came to the conclusion that a universally recognized sign that was simple and easy to maintain was, in fact, the greatest value. Next slide, please. The Oversight Committee actually adopted the signage in the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD, which we're all familiar with, and a simple modified D11-1 bike guide sign is what they chose to adopt. What they wanted to make sure of, though, was that all signs had the opportunity for branding, so you could do a sign topper, so that if a jurisdiction chose to brand any particular route, and we have some groups in Ventura County that are working on bike tourism within the county. So the Pacific Coast route, or there's a very difficult route that winds through the mountains and more scenic areas of Ventura County called the Grand Loop, that we could put these on top of the simple signs to identify those. Also, it was found that simple warning signs for grade were really important. And so very generic uphill, downhill signs were recommended. We maintained the standard MUTCD standard colors so that if you leave Ventura County, these signs would still be common in your ride. And you know, although they're not terribly ornate, terribly sexy, these were the signs that our committee found would provide the best value and would be easiest to maintain over time. Next slide. We looked at 18 specific locations to inform communities of how things should be signed. And we gave very detailed instructions, or created detailed instructions of how these signs should work, where they should be placed, how many feet from the intersection. And this provided a toolbox that every city could use in terms of sign placement. Next slide, please. We had funding for a number of signs as part of the project, and the committee selected 18 locations that would provide signage throughout the county and allow riders to make sort of crucial turning movements. But as we started with that, the city sort of took over and started to put signs up on their own according to the plan. One of the things that we encountered here at the signage, once signs actually started to go in, that sort of took us by surprise, was that in the committee structure and in the signage debate, we chose as a group not to name routes. We numbered the routes so that we could discuss them for planning purposes, but the numbering convention was not designed to be a naming convention. However, when signage came to implementation, a number of the communities really wanted to use the numbering system that the wayfinding plan had identified. So sort of by default, the numbering system that we used became the default route path. And then there were some discussions to keep continuity with other designations. So since the adoption of the plan, we've actually wound up changing the route numbering system to match other conventions, other naming conventions within the county. And most prominently, if you're looking at this map, Route 4 goes down the coast. But of course, in California, we know that Route 1 traverses the coast. So we have since then changed the wayfinding Route 4 to Route 1 to match the coastal route. So that was an interesting turn, which we didn't anticipate. But we've accommodated that wish by the communities. Next slide, please. Now, towards the end, I'm going to talk about the funding a little bit. The way VCTC had been funding bike routes was to take TDA Article 3 funds and have a competitive process each year. So that took a very small amount of funds and split it up 11 ways. And it was really difficult for cities to develop, substantial or really groundbreaking or transformative bike projects in Ventura County. And Ventura County, again, doesn't have a local transportation measure. So coming up with local money to match federal funds was also very difficult. And we really wanted to encourage the more transformative and substantial projects. So we set aside about 40% of our CMAQ funding, and and set aside our Article 3 money and created a 2-year call for projects so that local agencies could use the Article 3 money as match for the CMAQ. And we combined these into a 2-year call for projects. And our first year out, we wound up giving away or funding approximately $8 million worth of bicycle projects on the regional network. We changed the funding criteria and gave anything on the regional network additional points so that it really will encourage and did encourage development of the regional bike network. And we were very pleased in the very first funding cycle that a very large segment of one of our regional pathways, our regional routes, was taken on by the county, connecting Thousand Oaks with our neighboring county in LA, connecting Thousand Oaks to Westlake. It's a very heavily used and popular route. And so we were very pleased with the overall outcome of the wayfinding effort to identify and prioritize the routes, and the accompanying change in funding strategies that allowed that development to happen. And with that, I think that concludes. Just to sort of wrap up, we identified and prioritized 17 regional routes that connected the cities of Ventura County. That equals about 413 miles of regional route networks. And we have a toolkit which allows for a uniform sign design for very easy wayfinding. And I have to say that the team that guided us through this from Alta was exceptional. Emily Duchan and James, I can't say enough about how they guided us through the project. Anyone who's deals with expert level bikers know that they're a very demanding crowd, and it wanted a great deal from us in this project. And I believe that Alta provided the product that those bikers, those expert bikers, along with city and county staff, really wanted. So I will turn it back to the next presenter.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So my name is Christopher Zhang. I'm from the Western Riverside Council of Governments, and I'll be discussing our recently approved active transportation plan. So to continue our love fest for consultants, you'll see on the screen that Farron Pierce, Alta, and Ramey were the consultants on this project. It's 2 years in the making, and they did a fantastic job, as hopefully you'll see in the presentation. Next slide, please, India. So I wanted to start off the presentation with opportunities and challenges in the WRCOG subregion, so that hopefully participants, you guys have a frame of reference while I describe the plan and the process. Next slide. So when we discuss opportunities, we think about attractions, destinations, basically where people want to go, where they want to go via walking, biking, or driving. So contrary to the perception of the Inland Empire, we have a lot of opportunities here, I believe. We have downtown Riverside, which is on the top left, the Festival of Lights. There are fireworks on a nightly basis, but the fireworks definitely help. On the top right, we have the Santa Ana River Trail, which is actually a very popular trail that connects the northern portion of the Western Riverside County subregion to San Bernardino and Orange County. To the south, there's Temecula, and then the Temecula Valley wine country, which is actually a large economic driver for us. It's about $700 million as has been estimated. And then on the bottom right, we as WRCOG, we also are able to minimally implement bike facilities with our Transportation Uniform Mitigation Fee Program, which is an impact fee on development that's utilized to mitigate regional traffic impacts. Next slide. Then when we look at challenges, we have the challenge where the automobile is king. I think a lot of our participants probably experienced that as well. This picture on the bottom right is the 91 East heading back to Riverside. So this kind of symbolizes a lot of the challenges that we face as it pertains to active transportation in the subregion. Of course, the car is a king, but there's also the challenge of the jobs housing balance. We have a lot of residents that commute to Orange, LA, and San Diego counties. So that reduces the possibility and increases the challenge of active transportation as a daily mode of transportation. The picture on the top left looks like an opportunity. There's some complete streets treatments evident. The speed limit's relatively low at 35 miles an hour. However, the challenge is since our subregion, there's the jobs housing balance and just having a lot of people in the vehicles, it's just a challenge trying to implement more of these types of projects on the top left. Apologize. May I get the next slide? So as a Council of Governments, we don't have any land use authority or any authority to implement projects. Our goal is to take the issues and challenges that we face, that a lot of our jurisdictions face, provide a forum for them to discuss, and then hopefully we are able to provide possible solutions for them. We've been pretty successful at implementing regional programs that our jurisdictions have realized benefits, so the active transportation plan was a good fit. Active transportation is a great example of looking at jurisdictional challenges at a regional level. So in 2016, WRCOG received ATP funding for a sub-region active transportation plan. We're excited that some of our jurisdictions have applied in addition to this AT plan. They've applied for ATP funding and have been awarded, and also we've submitted quite a few applications for Cycle 4. So the goal of the AT plan was to provide a non-motorized network throughout the WRCOG region for people who either need or choose to be mobile in a non-motorized mode, and develop a regional network utilizing the plans already created by our jurisdictions. The plan, we want to emphasize that the plan is voluntary, and our goal is that our jurisdictions and stakeholders utilize the plan as a resource in the pursuit of grant funding for active transportation, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And the plans also utilize as a kind of a guiding document of how the identified projects in the plan can be implemented. Next slide, please. So as we developed the plan, we utilized our existing committees for outreach. We have a monthly committee meeting with our planning directors and our public works directors of our member agencies that we utilize as a sounding board for outreach to our member jurisdictions. In addition, we utilized stakeholder groups such as the Riverside County Active Transportation Network as advisors and gathering input and feedback. So in 2016, we established goals and objectives for the plan and developed a draft network. We spent a lot of the last year refining the facilities with agency staff as well as drafting the plan. Next slide, please. So the plan contains the listed items on the screen. I'll go into a little bit more detail in the coming slides, but one item that was of great interest to our jurisdictions was the collisions analysis, which is included in the plan, but I'll get into a little bit more of the collisions analysis in the coming slides. So what we're really trying to achieve with the plan is that it's only the beginning. We actually did a non-motorized transportation plan for the Western County in 2010, but we kind of noticed that no projects were being implemented, and so we kind of wanted to take a different approach with this 2018 plan, which again I'll get into a little. And what we're trying to do with the plan is trying to provide assistance to our member agencies if they're really interested in providing additional active transportation options. Again, this goes back to kind of our our goal. We're not trying to force anything upon our jurisdictions. We're just trying to assist those that would like assistance. Next slide, please. So one of the items listed was the regional network. Here's a look at the network that was identified with assistance from jurisdiction staff. In addition, we also looked at input from prior local and regional plans, collision review, and analyzed regional destinations. And then I go back to the opportunity slide and the importance of that analysis of analyzing where people are going and would want to go with what's offered in the subregion. Next slide, please. So as mentioned before, we conducted a series of follow-up conversations with jurisdiction staff, a lot of the times with neighboring jurisdictions, to ensure their input was accurate and included in the network. The screen kind of gives you an idea of the types of items and kind of the criteria that we utilize to develop the regional network. Then next slide, please. So this is kind of what we really wanted to highlight with our active transportation plan. These are detailed project level summary sheets for each of the identified facilities on the regional network. We spent a good probably year, maybe even a little bit more of our efforts on these project sheets, because the information that we're providing on these sheets is what is required on the ATP application. I harp on, I kind of emphasize our goal of trying to assist those jurisdictions that want to implement active transportation. So what we're really trying to do is tee these projects up for jurisdiction staff to utilize in pursuing grant funding. As shown on the screen, you can see that project descriptions provided, key destinations, connections for the transportation network. Also included is collision data, demographics of the project area, what the project does for the health environment, benefits of implementing the facility. And I think, India, please, next slide, please. So we also included how the project fares for DAC. We included cost estimates and feasibility items to consider when implementing. Next slide. So one additional item that came out of the funding is bicycle pedestrian education and support. I actually came to WRCOG a little bit kind of when the project was started. So this bicycle and pedestrian education support was kind of a surprise, but it's actually been a huge hit, and it's something that we're trying to see if we can fund more. We supported a few community events. We also conducted education workshops for cyclists and conducted law and education workshops with police departments. We're trying to find more funds to support these, as they've been pretty successful. And then last slide, please. So the plan also identifies a few next steps for WRCOG. We'll continue to assist our member agencies in seeking grant funding. We actually have a grant writing assistance program where we'll assist our member jurisdictions in applying and basically executing the application. We just helped, I believe it was 5 of our member jurisdictions in applying for ATP that just passed in July. We'll continue to identify and hold training courses for jurisdiction staff as it relates to active transportation. We did also actually help this out with a complete streets workshop for jurisdiction staff a couple months ago. That was a huge hit. And then we're having initial discussions for a Safe Routes to School program in the county with county public health. And we're going to continue these discussions. And then we're going to continue to look for opportunities to promote bicycle education and just increasing active transportation options in the county. The City of Riverside's interested in holding a larger open streets event We've committed to helping them find funds for that, and we're willing to help a lot of our other jurisdictions. So kind of in conclusion, the plan is, the plans for our member jurisdictions, the goal is to help them implement these projects. We're going to continue to help them as far as finding grant funding, helping them apply for those funds. And then we'll also continue to do the open streets as well as bicycle education as well. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Miguel Ramos from the LA County Department of Public Health.
Great, thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Miguel Ramos. I'm the outreach manager for the step-by-step Los Angeles County pedestrian plans for unincorporated communities. So this project was funded through Caltrans's Active Transportation Program. Step-by-step is a general plan level document, which is part of the county's mobility element, and includes policies, programs, and procedures to improve pedestrian safety in unincorporated areas of Los Angeles County. It also includes community pedestrian plans that propose specific infrastructure projects for 4 communities that are defined as disadvantaged by the state's CalEnviro screen. These communities, one of the communities includes rural Lake Los Angeles. The step-by-step framework allows us to continue adding community-based pedestrian plans in the document for each of the remaining unincorporated areas as resources allow. Now, the goal of the project was to make sure that LA County is a place where it's safe for people to walk around, whether that's getting to school, work, shopping, recreation, where streets, sidewalks, and paths in Los Angeles County will be transformed to promote healthy and active lifestyles. Now, this specific planning project is being led by the Department of Public Health PLACE program and developed in collaboration with Alta Planning and Design, and our fellow county departments such as Public Works, Regional Planning, and Parks and Recreation. And we also hired 3 community-based organizations to assist with outreach. And in the case for Lake Los Angeles, we partnered with Antelope Valley Partners for Health. So what's different about this project is we wanted a robust public engagement process built on the local knowledge and relationships. Therefore, we allocated a substantial portion of the budget, almost half of the budget, to focus on outreach and community engagement component. By hiring local CBOs, we are able to build off existing community knowledge and trust that the government just doesn't have on its own. And I myself was hired to manage the outreach by overseeing the community-based organizations. Now, the plan is currently in draft form, but will eventually be adopted by the Board of Supervisors by this fall or winter. And regardless of adoption, we are moving forward with pursuing funding for some of the infrastructure projects that we have identified already. Next slide, please. Great. So a little bit of context of Lake Los Angeles. It's located in the northeast part of LA County. It's pretty much in the middle of the desert, mostly a low-income residential community that is low density for the county. There's high rates of disability in the community. More than 1 in 10 adults in Lake Los Angeles under the age of 65 have a disability, which is more than twice in the county's average. In addition, childhood and asthma and adult asthma rates in Lake Los Angeles are higher than the county average. And obesity rates among adults and teens are higher than the county as a whole. So again, this community is defined as disadvantaged by the CalEnviro screen. Next slide, please. So the project staff from Antelope Valley Partners for Health and DPH have built out in the community engagement, have done community engagement for the past 2 years. We've broken it out into 2 different phases, pre-draft and post-draft. The budget for outreach has helped us to ensure that the final plan reflects the community needs and wants and has a broad support for implementation. So we've done a lot of different things. So we've attended existing events, such as resource fairs, programming at the local parks. We met with different groups, such as faith-based organizations, local neighborhood action councils, parent-teacher organizations, and we held focus groups with people with disabilities, monolingual Spanish-speaking parents, and youth. In addition, we formed a community advisory committee specifically for this project, which has met over 8 times and has representation from the senior population, local community leaders, people from the local council, other folks from the Parks Association, and we made sure that there was Spanish-speaking representation in this committee. Through this process, we also conducted trainings to do walk audits and pedestrian and bicycle counts with residents to help inform the plan and help, have community be part of that ownership of this plan and participate in the data collection. So they identified rates of walking, where people walk, and what they experience along their route. So this involved the community in developing the plan, and it really allowed for building awareness to the plan, and it helped us focus on intersections and path segments that people are most concerned about. We've also held workshops, and many of the workshops were in collaboration with existing meetings or existing organizations in the community. So we did not, hold workshops just on our own. It was through this robust community engagement where we were able to unpack and identify all the barriers and opportunities to walking in the community that ultimately came up with the lessons learned through this outreach process that I'm happy to share with you today. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges was making community input accessible. So from talking to many of the residents, many of the Spanish-speaking residents, they told us that they did not feel welcomed in the existing community meetings that were already happening. So they didn't participate at the formal community meetings. So therefore, we looked at opportunities of where the Spanish-speaking community was meeting. So they were meeting at the local park. We used methods to engage residents to, not just sit around a table, but make it fun. So where we invited parents and kids to take walks along specific routes to identify issues and barriers. So we, again, included community residents in the data collection process. Some opportunities were being able to conduct meetings all in Spanish. So we worked directly with our outreach consultants to engage residents in community walks and to talk about these barriers and opportunities. So another opportunity or something that came from this is really identifying or proposing a policy in this plan that ensures that community residents have access to translation, childcare, and food as for these community meetings and any activities when it comes to the development of projects in their community. Next slide, please. Yes, okay. So yes, another challenge was the traffic, the truck traffic. So there's a large amount of truck traffic that cuts through this community. To avoid the high desert corridor, many of these trucks are carrying different materials, and some of it being hazardous. And it's many of these times these trucks take on the routes where there's a lot of schools and cuts through residential neighborhoods. So what was interesting about the process is that one of the residents that participated in our pedestrian and bike count training took it upon themselves to do similar counts for the trucks that are passing through the community. So they counted a large number of trucks and used that data to request that the county public works conduct their own study on how to deter this disruptive and dangerous cut through traffic. So again, this kind of highlights the community determination. And it was through this process that, through the residents' data, that helped determine that none of the roads favored by the trucks are actually designated truck routes. So in our plan, we actually proposed rumble strips and other traffic calming measures like rectangular rapid flash beacons and other pedestrian signals that slow down traffic through the community to possibly deter truck drivers from using this community as a cut through. Next slide, please. Great. So given that many of these trucks were cutting through this neighborhood or this community, a lot of these corridors that cut through are still high-speed corridors. This creates a dangerous condition for students and families who walk to school. Many parents, through our community engagement process, have expressed concerns for the high speeds and fearing for the safety of their children walking to school. So some challenges that we did see is that there is no indication that people are entering a community. Most of the roads leading up to the community have signs of 50 miles per hour, and the community has shared with us that people drive even faster than that. So many of the proposed crossing improvements that the community requested that we found did not meet warrants for the lack of pedestrian volumes. So some opportunities that we saw through this process is work directly with the schools that were kind of on the periphery of these corridors to identify the proper treatments that make it safer for students to walk to school, host workshops in collaboration with the local schools to get additional parent input, and invite public works staff for a site visit to discuss options for improving safety in light of warrants and other guidelines. Next slide, please. So another challenge that came about is that this Lake Los Angeles is also part of the Antelope Valley area plan that again includes Lake Los Angeles, and they have a specific ordinance that limits the light pollution that is held at the community. So many of the community are strongly in support of the dark skies ordinance. It's one of the reasons they love living where they do, but it presents a challenge for community members that walk to or from the park in the evenings. So in our plan, some opportunities we identified is that we could do pedestrian scale lighting that illuminates where people walk and accommodating the community's desire for dark skies. Again, making it safer for people to walk from and to the park in the evening. And then again, this is another opportunity to educate residents on existing plans and find ways to address the need for lighting for community members. Next slide, please. Great. So challenge that we face right here is a lack of safe spaces for people walking and rolling in the community. There are some existing bike paths, but they are very narrow, and they're only located in certain parts of the community. While some of the paths have a buffer between the travel lane, they do not have a physical protection, such as a guardrail or flexible delineators to protect people from walking or biking from cars and trucks that are driving over 50 miles per hour. Again, community often uses these paths to get to school, and cars often drive over the paths, which damage the path and surface quality. So in addition, Lake LA has an increasing elderly population and large disability population, and many depend on walking or motorized chairs and bikes to get around, as you can see in that photo. They often have to share the road with high-speed cars and trucks. And as you can see in this middle photo right here, many of the public transit stops are located in places that have no paths at all. Many people often walk directly through the desert, as we've heard through our community engagement process, and rarely, they use that as the most direct route to their destinations. Or they use drainage ditches along the shoulder, as the vast majority of roads lack sidewalks. So some opportunities were to work with community residents to identify locations where to define multi-use paths or paved aspects, create buffers such as Western-style fencing that reflects the rural nature of the community, and create paths and locations where there is public transit stops. So next slide, please. And given that we identified many multi-use trails, we ran into a challenge that the project team didn't really anticipate. So the civic heart of the community, the park surrounding the county-owned land, is a tribal sacred place, and turns out that this was once a native village. So we actually had proposed formalizing a trail through this area that connected to the park, but it was a culturally sensitive area. And since our plan is both subject to CEQA and is an amendment to our general plan, we had to follow the laws of AB 52 and SB 18, which require that we reach out to area Native American tribes and offer them a chance to consult on the project. So rural Lake LA has a vast areas of what's called native soil and undisturbed land that might not find in an urban setting like our other 3 pedestrian plan communities. So 2 tribes asked to consult, and as both tribes' traditional lands include Lake Los Angeles, and both were concerned about known tribal cultural resources in the community. Interestingly, the community is equally aware of the area's Native American heritage. Residents specifically asked that the project in the plan speak to the history through their aesthetic design and possibly including interpretive signage where appropriate. So some opportunities came from this process where we're developing language in the plan and our environmental document to address sacred places and a plan to re-engage tribes during implementation. So being sensitive to the sites in our communities that have already been disturbed due to the development. So government agencies still have a responsibility to avoid harming native peoples and their sacred places, particularly in rural areas where native soils may hold undisturbed tribal cultural resources. So by taking on this, it forced our Parks Department as well to take a closer look at our planning document and understand what their role would be when developing any new trails or expanding the park in the Lake LA community. Okay, next slide, please. So some lessons learned. Regardless of where you might be working, whether it be in a rural community, small town, big city, by meeting people where they're at, it allows for various residents to participate in the planning process. By engaging community members early on and frequently you build that trust and relationships that government hasn't had before. By providing trainings for residents to understand the pedestrian plan process or any process of planning, it allows for the community to hold the county or any jurisdiction accountable and creating self-determination for residents to continue to advocate for improvements after a plan is adopted. And by lifting up and centering voices of residents who are often marginalized, it allows for residents to build rapport again with government and to have them inform the final product so it reflects and is representative of the community, which includes in this process Native voices and Spanish-speaking communities. So again, by collaborating with various departments, we can have discussions and make sure that this plan is supported and acted upon by several departments. Next slide. So if you have any concerns or comments, feel free to reach out and I will get back to you. We're eager to hear from your questions and comments, and I'm gonna give it off to Sam Corbett with Alta.
Thanks, Miguel. Indy, are you going to continue to drive?
Yes.
You will. Okay, great. I'll let you pull up my presentation then. So maybe I'll just get things started. So I'll be presenting on the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. This was a document that we put together in coordination with FHWA a couple of years ago. It's certainly a reference and resource that resonates with me as someone who grew up as a latchkey kid in a small town. I spent a lot of time walking and bicycling around my community. And like a lot of other small towns and rural areas, there's actually a fair amount of walking and biking that occurs despite a lack and oftentimes absence of facilities and infrastructure that actually support the activity. Fortunately, many of the county roads or state highways that run through rural areas or small towns can be retrofitted or redesigned to provide a transportation network that better serves the safety, health, and economic interests of these communities. Next slide, please, India. So just a brief outline of the presentation this morning. I'm planning to give an overview of design flexibility, briefly discuss the content and facility types that are presented in the STAR guide, and then I will go into a little more detail on a couple specific design treatments, the advisory shoulder, pedestrian lane, and side path. So first off, getting into design flexibility, if you could move on to the next slide, please, India. So in 2010, FHWA released a policy statement, which was really quite a bold federal commitment to walking and bicycling. And they talked about, obviously some of the benefits associated with walking and bicycling, better health, reduced vehicle emissions, fuel use, etc. But then they also went on to encourage transportation agencies to go beyond the minimum requirements. And this really was a clear and unambiguous invitation for local jurisdictions to go further and to be flexible when designing for walking and bicycling. And I guess the other key point here is the use of all ages and abilities. And this is something that I think we've all heard of, but it's really about providing facilities and infrastructure that work for everybody. And it's not just the people who are out there doing it now, but it's the people, from 8 to 80, and thinking about the more vulnerable users and the people that are feel uncomfortable and aren't currently using transport infrastructure because they don't feel like it's safe or they're not comfortable. And so that's really sort of a key point. FHWA followed this up in 2013. Could you move to the next slide, India? So they followed this up with the design flexibility memo, which really just reinforced the 2010 memo. In this memo, they specifically referenced a couple design guides. One was the NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide. They also referenced the ITE Designing Walkable Urban Thoroughfares Guide. So they're really pointing local jurisdictions to these references and resources and encouraging people to use them. I guess part of the issue here, though, is they tended to be focused on urban areas. Next slide, please, India. This next slide provides some of those references, and so it was as I mentioned, the Walkable Thoroughfares NACTO Urban Bikeway Design Guide. There was also a companion Urban Street Design Guide to that put out by NACTO, and these were all great multimodal design references and guides, but they focused very much on sort of urban or suburban environments, and much of the U.S. and certainly the SCAG region fall outside of those categories. Well, maybe a lot of the populations are concentrated in the urban areas. The much more geographic space is either rural or small town environment. So that's where the small town and rural multimodal networks came in to fill a gap. If you could move to the next slide, please. So this was really a design guideline for the rest of us. So it was intended to be context specific, apply to rural small town environments. As I noted, it's about 3/4 of the 3,000 counties in the U.S. are rural, and it constitutes nearly 20% of the U.S. population. So this is, and I guess as Steve mentioned in the first presentation, and these connecting these communities, oftentimes you have a decent multimodal network in the small towns, but it's really important that you be able to have these regional connections too, so that people can get between towns or different communities through a more rural environment. So that was really the focus of this guide. Next slide, please. So this just provides an overview of the guide itself. It's some sort of context of how to apply the guide, where the design treatments are appropriate. The chapters 2 through 4 provide specific guidance on the different facility types and treatments. And as I mentioned, I'll get into a couple of them. And then the last chapters, one focuses on kind of network opportunities, and the last one is more of a kind of planning and process and project development section. Okay, next slide, please. So similar to many of the other design guidelines I mentioned, like the NACDA Urban Bikeway Design Guide, this document is sort of very graphically rich. It's organized around the sort of appropriate application to make sure that it provides guidance as to when the treatment is used, in what context and circumstances. It highlights many of the benefits associated with the specific design treatment, provides case studies, examples of where that design treatment has in fact been implemented. And then lastly, it provides the actual design guidance on how the treatment, what it should look like, what sort of geometric design, marking, signs and lines, etc. Okay, so there are, next slide please. So the kind of 3 main categories of the design treatments and facilities, and that's mixed traffic, visually separated, and physically separated. So you could sort of think of this as a toolbox of sorts, and there are a number of different facility types in each of these categories. But the mixed traffic one is really exactly that. It's not actually designating or delineating any specific space. Whereas as you move through and across, you have a visual separation, and then lastly is like the full separated treatment. So it's considered to be, you pick the right category and the right treatment for the context and the facility that you're working with. Next slide, please. So just briefly, I wanted to go through the example application. So this is all sort of, in chapter 1 of the STAR guide, but sort of 3 key considerations for each of the design treatments. First is speed and volume. So for each of these treatments, essentially, there is a preferred both volume, or average daily traffic, and speed of the existing roadway. So in this case right here, this example, they're saying that anywhere 3,000 vehicles a day or less is kind of the preferred volume, and speeds of 25 miles per hour or less is the preferred speed. But it could go up as high as 6,000 AADT or as high as 35 miles per hour. The next category is the network type. So also broken out into local roads, collectors, and highways. And then the last consideration for the application of the design treatment is to look at the land use surrounding the area, and it's broken up into sort of 2 categories there, one of which is kind of small towns, so that's kind of the built-up areas, and then the other is the real rural area that's connecting the small towns. Next slide, please. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but it really is the basis of the whole guide is these real world examples. These are all treatments that are out in place And so we for each of the treatments, we provide valuable case studies that present some of the benefits, some of the project background, how they came to be, what the design looks like in that specific instance, what sort of network role it plays, and then also if there were any funding considerations tied to the project, or how they actually developed the project and implemented it. Okay, next slide, please. So now I'll get into a few of the specific design treatments. As I mentioned, there are 3 that I'll just cover in the presentation. There's obviously a lot more in the guide. I tried to pick the ones that are either more controversial or different from sort of existing guidance. So the first of which is the advisory shoulder. It's probably the most controversial treatment in the whole guide. And then I'll briefly discuss the pedestrian lane and the side path. So the advisory shoulder is a treatment where if you oftentimes don't have the width, the sort of cross-section, curb-to-curb width to actually stripe a bike lane and maintain a travel lane in each direction. This is an application that has been implemented in a number of different communities around the country. And I'll get into the specifics. Can you move to the next slide, please, India? So this graphic here shows the advisory shoulder and what the treatment is. Essentially, it is a center travel lane that is, so it's really just one lane. There's no center line. It is, there is a shoulder striped on each side that provides space for cyclists, but is also used for passing vehicles. So the idea is that when it is, that center lane is too narrow for vehicles, so they are intended when, obviously when there's no pedestrians or cyclists in the lane, they're intended to go into the shoulder to provide enough space for traffic if there's an oncoming vehicle. So it's all about context. This is, as we mentioned in the previous slide about application, this is intended to be on fairly low volume, ideally less than 3,000 ADT, fairly low speed, ideally less than 25 miles per hour. Next slide, please, India. Should note that this is not a approved treatment by FHWA, but as I mentioned, this is in place in well over a dozen communities around the country. It is required that you go through the request to experiment through FHWA. So this is section 1A10 of the MUTCD. Could you move to the next slide, please, India? So, yeah, as I mentioned here, there is, this actually probably should be updated. There's no performance, there's minimal performance data available at this point. It really has only been in place for a couple years in the US. This is a treatment that is widely used in Europe, but it's fairly new to the US. I guess the other key point to make here is that FHWA is also accepting requests for experimentation for a similar treatment called dash bicycle lanes. And it's really quite similar. It seems to be the main difference is to actually stripe the bicycle logo and arrow in with the dash bike lanes. And I should also mention that while this image is showing kind of a colored pavement or treatment here, that isn't necessary. It's sort of an optional treatment. And in fact, most communities that we've evaluated that are using this advisory shoulder do not use any sort of colored treatment for the shoulder. Next slide, please. Okay, just I know some engineers, they see experimentation, it makes them nervous. So I guess our guidance on this is don't be intimidated by experimentation. This does contribute to the practice and develops safer design treatments that we all benefit from. But it is, particularly if you're using federal funding, it is a requirement by FHWA that you go through this process. I should mention, however, that not all cities or different jurisdictions that have implemented this have gone through the FHWA. It seems about half of them have and are doing the formal experimentation process with FHWA. Next slide. Okay, I think I've mostly covered this. So this is just the actual particulars of it, that it's a permissive broken lane line. Potentially you can use the contrasting paving materials if you want, not necessary though. The center line is a two-way center travel lane. Obviously yield to bicyclists or pedestrians. So pedestrians can use and do use the shoulder in this context. However, it isn't typically marked. The next treatment I'm going to is more specific to pedestrians. Next slide, please, India. Again, just a little more guidance on this. So the center lane is typically between 10 and 18 feet in width, sort of by design. If you're doing anything more than that, you probably have space to actually do just standard bike lanes on each side while maintaining the two travel lanes. I think I've covered all of this off. As I mentioned, the ideal AADT is 3,000 of, we published a white paper last year that looked at the dozen different installations around the US, and the highest AADT that we saw in those installations was 4,500. Next slide, please. Just a couple examples of where this has been put in place. So this is the sign that has been used. This is specifically from Hanover, New Hampshire. And it shows kind of the intent of this treatment, how when another vehicle's coming, that the vehicle merges, yields into the shoulder. Yielding, it's kind of interesting in this case, while they're not marking pedestrians or cyclists in the lane, they are acknowledging their presence on this sign. And once again, this isn't a standard sign, so this is sort of a unique sign that they developed for this particular application. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a photo from Hanover. Hanover is where Dartmouth is, so a small town in New England, college community. There was a fair amount of community engagement and involvement with this before this installation went in place. Next slide, please, India. This shows sort of same treatment, but with pedestrians on the shoulder. And it's probably worth noting that California law requires that when there are no sidewalks, pedestrians walk against the flow of traffic. So while these kids are not in California, they are actually abiding by what our laws would be. So this is, a useful facility for both pedestrians and bicyclists, and it can be done at fairly low cost when you don't have the width or right of way to actually put in sidewalks or bike lanes in this case. One last thing to note on this treatment, this facility has been evaluated now for about 3 years in Hanover, and with positive results. They are now expanding. This was initially put in as a pilot, and they're expanding it for a longer stretch of this roadway, which is Valley Road, and they're planning to install it in other roads throughout the community as well. Next slide, please. This is a similar treatment. So this is from Bloomington, Indiana, a larger community. I think the thing worth noting on this one is that that shoulder is serving as a de facto sidewalk in the absence of a sidewalk. So in this instance, there is a sidewalk on one side, but not on the other side of the street. Next slide. This is a similar treatment, but with the presence of on-street parking. So this is from Minnesota. So once again, they didn't want to remove the parking, so they didn't have enough space to actually stripe bike lanes and maintain the two travel lanes. So they put in the advisory shoulder. Next slide shows a similar treatment from Boulder, Colorado. So this is one side on-street parking. This particular street, Harvard Lane, lies between a 6-lane arterial and mixed density residential neighborhood. And so it really serves as a key connection for bicyclists to travel between kind of downtown Boulder and University of Colorado, and had already had pretty high bicycle volumes on it. So this really just provided them with a better connection and some space, while not dedicated like a bike lane, with at least some delineation using the advisory shoulders. And it has also been received well, and they're planning to expand this facility treatment to other sections of the network. Okay, so next slide, please. As I mentioned, we've evaluated a number of these advisory shoulder treatments, and we've wrote it up in this white paper. So it's another reference that's available if you want to find out more about it. Next slide, please. I'm going to just briefly cover two other treatments. One being the pedestrian lane. So this, another probably more significant pieces of guidance in the guide. It can be effective for delineating a pedestrian corridor without incurring significant capital costs that would be associated, say, with putting sidewalks. Sometimes more rural communities don't want sidewalks. They don't feel like it fits the nature of their community. Next slide, please. Oftentimes these are put in as an interim or temporary treatment. I should note that there are a number of considerations with this type of treatment. Next slide, please, India. One of which is the detectability for people with vision disabilities. Another is that bicyclists may want to use the facility, so it's always a consideration in design. Certainly the accessibility requirements as well. So the cross slope requirements, for instance, need to be considered, making sure that they're not exceeding the 2% maximum as per ADA. And then also the surface type, ensuring that the surface is firm, stable, and slip resistant. And of course, other maintenance issues like sweeping or snow removal in more colder climates. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, often these are put in oftentimes as a temporary treatment, or certainly a low-cost treatment, and they can be quite effective at filling a gap between two sort of key trip generators or attractors. The minimum width is 5 feet. If it's a busy corridor, we recommend going up to as high as 8 or 9 feet to ensure enough space for people to walk 2 to 3 abreast. Next slide, please. There's just a couple images of this treatment in place. It's from the lesser known Detroit, Oregon. Next slide, please, India. Next one here is from Wyoming, Teton Village. Again, just sort of a marked ped lane on one side of the road, designating that space for pedestrians. Okay, last treatment I wanted to cover is the side path. So the side path this is not a new treatment, but it has The side path has had kind of a turbulent ride over the years, and particularly due to concerns with crossing of driveways, cross streets, and any other transition where there is potential conflict. But pedestrians and bicyclists have always responded quite well to them because they provide this sort of dedicated space that is fully separated from the road corridor. So in our experience, many of the concerns that are raised with side paths can be mitigated effectively with good design. So just want to go through a few of those specific designs. Next slide, please, India. So here, this highlights what we refer to as the bend out treatment. So one of the benefits of the bend out, and that's that curve that you can see sort of in the left side of the slide, really what that does is a vehicle entering or exiting the cross street, it breaks out their decision making. So they have the decision that they have right there at the limit line, right before they get to the high visibility crosswalk. That's one decision they need to make, look, both ways for heads or bikes. And then it separates that decision with their actual merge onto the main road. So as opposed to having it be, if that was right up against the road, oftentimes the driver is already thinking about merging into the road. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, a lot of this side path does exist. We're providing more specific design guidance on how it can be effectively implemented, focusing very much on looking at separation distances, how you deal with minor intersections and other transitions to other facilities. That's often the challenge, is how when you have a side path that then merges into shoulder facilities or bike lanes, how do you actually handle that transition? And the next slide provides one example of how that can be done. So this is the instance of having a side path that then ends and transitions to shoulders. So what we're recommending in this instance is that the one direction is pretty easy. You just bring the side path straight into the shoulder. But the other direction can be challenging, and we're proposing be considered, and ideally in a sort of best practice situation be implemented, is putting in pedestrian refuge islands, putting in a high visibility crosswalk, teeing up that crossing so that it's a 90-degree crossing, and transitioning the shoulder facility straight into crossing the road and into the side path facility. Okay, just one example of this from California. I'm cognizant that a lot of our examples have not been California based, but this is South Lake Tahoe. Is the next slide, please, India. So this is a side path up in Tahoe that oftentimes one of the benefits of the side path, it really does lend itself to the more of a rural feel, and they're often embraced by rural communities. So you see a fair number of that sort of context. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time during this webinar. I guess one last thing I wanted to mention for those of you who are interested in finding out more about the STAR guide. Next slide, please, India. And next one more. This slide here provides the reference, so it's available for download at FHWA's site. So that URL there will get you to the guide, and it's a free download. So by all means, go check it out. Thank you very much for your time, and I think we're going to open it up now to any questions. India, maybe you want to facilitate the questions.
Thank you, Sam. So everyone, if you have a question, please type it in the chat box on the right of your screen. We actually have a question from Rich M. and this, I guess, is for everyone, for all the speakers. Are there any zoning code changes that can support complete streets improvements, like requiring additional short-term biking, short-term bike parking, etc.? If anyone has any response to that.
Yeah, I can try to field that one, India.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes as a, there's various development requirements that they provide and meet bicycle parking requirements. It's obviously by sort of jurisdiction, but we often work with, different cities that will, just like, vehicle parking, they'll have an ordinance or, zoning requirement that X number of both short and or long-term bicycle parking spaces are required as per the, it's usually based upon either square footage or number of units in the development. So that certainly is a requirement that different jurisdictions can put in place.
All right, thank you. So if there's any more questions, please type them into the chat box. Looks like we've got a quiet group here. So if there's no more questions, we can wrap this up. I'll be sending everyone a link to the presentations and a recording of the webinar once we post it online. I have your emails if you registered. If you're on and you didn't register and you need to send me your email, my email address is brookhover@scag.ca.gov. That's B as in boy, ROOKOV as in Valentine, ER@scag.ca.gov. And thanks to everyone for participating.